Some love stories don't begin with perfection, they begin with a collision. Two worlds crashing, two hearts resisting, and a spark that refuses to die. This is the story of James and Ruby. The story that Maxton Hall tried to break, but fate kept pulling together. James always believed he knew exactly where he belonged. His life was perfectly arranged. Wealth, reputation, power, and a future already written for him. Nothing ever surprised him. Nothing ever shook his world. Until Ruby walked in. She entered Maxton Hall quietly, like someone trying not to upset the balance of the room. But somehow she changed every balance James ever had. Ruby didn't come from privilege. She came from effort, from late-night studying and dreams too big to fit inside the walls of her old life. She wasn't supposed to cross paths with someone like James. But destiny rarely asks for permission. One small moment, a folder slipping from her hands, papers scattering across the classroom floor, became the spark that forced their worlds to meet. James looked down at her, not knowing that this simple moment would mark the beginning of something he could never control. Ruby looked up at him with eyes full of determination, not fear. That alone caught him off guard. She wasn't impressed by his name. She wasn't shaken by his status. She saw right through him, and for the first time in a long time. James didn't know what to do. For Ruby, James was everything she promised herself to avoid. Arrogant, privileged, and dangerously charming. But there was something else hidden beneath his perfect image, something she couldn't name yet, something almost vulnerable. She didn't trust it, but she couldn't deny she noticed it. That first moment was brief. A few seconds, maybe even forgettable to anyone watching. But for them, it was the beginning of a storm that would challenge their beliefs, a storm that would blur the lines between hate and longing, a storm that neither of them was ready for yet, neither could walk away from. This was the moment their story began, quietly but powerfully. And once it started, nothing at Maxton Hall would ever be the same again. From that day on, something shifted between James and Ruby, even though neither of them would admit it. Their worlds weren't meant to fit together, one built on privilege, the other built on survival. But life kept placing them in the same moments, the same rooms, the same quiet spaces where their guarded masks slowly began to crack. James tried to pretend Ruby didn't matter. To him, she was just another scholarship student, someone who didn't understand his world. But deep down, he felt something different, an uncomfortable curiosity. Why didn't she look at him like everyone else did? Why didn't she chase his approval? Why didn't she fear him? Every time he saw her in the hallway, focused and determined, something inside him pulled toward her, even when he tried to push it away. Ruby, on the other hand, tried even harder to keep her distance. She had goals, real ones. Her future depended on her focus. Getting tangled in James Beaufort's perfect mess of a life was the last thing she needed. Yet every time she told herself to ignore him, fate seemed to laugh a little. Group assignments, shared classes, unexpected run-ins. It was like the universe enjoyed throwing them together and watching the sparks fly. Their interactions were small, but charged. A glance held too long. A comment that came out sharper than needed. A silence that felt heavier than words. Ruby found James irritating, but she also sensed something broken behind his cold confidence. James found Ruby stubborn, but he also saw a strength he couldn't stop looking at. Slowly, our personalities began to clash in ways neither expected. Ruby challenged him. James confused her. And every disagreement left them thinking about each other long after the moment passed. They were like two different storms, one loud and one quiet, slowly moving closer, till there was no avoiding the crash. And deep inside, both of them knew it. Something was coming. Something big. Something that would change everything. Days passed at Maxton Hall, but the tension between James and Ruby only grew stronger. It wasn't loud or obvious, not yet. It was something quieter, like a pulse under the surface. Every time they crossed paths, something unspoken hung between them. Something neither of them knew how to name. Ruby kept telling herself to stay focused. She had a plan for her future, and James was not part of it. She reminded herself of this every morning. But then she'd see him across the courtyard, leaning against a wall with his usual confidence, and her heartbeat would skip in a way she didn't appreciate. She tried to ignore it, bury it, pretend it didn't exist. Yet every time he looked at her, truly looked, it was as if he saw straight past her defenses. James didn't want to admit his curiosity either. Ruby Miller wasn't the type of girl he was supposed to notice. She wasn't part of his world, his status, or his family's plans. But something about her drew him like a magnet. She was different calm where others were loud, focused instead of desperate for attention. And she didn't bend around him like everyone else did. It bothered him at first, then fascinated him. He caught himself looking for her in classrooms, scanning faces for hers, listening for her voice. It annoyed him. It excited him. It confused him. They both felt the pull, even as they tried to resist it. The smallest interactions now carried weight. When Ruby walked past James in the hallway, he felt the shift in the air. When James spoke to her, even casually, Ruby felt her guard tighten. Their friends noticed too thick glances, the silence. The spark neither of them acknowledged. But what neither of them saw was how this quiet pull was slowly shaping their path. It wasn't love yet, not fully. It wasn't hate anymore either. It was something in between, a growing connection. They didn't choose but couldn't escape, and even though they didn't understand it, something deep inside them whispered the same truth. This was only the beginning, as the weeks went by. Their silent connection became harder to ignore. The tension between James and Ruby was no longer something hidden beneath the surface. It was something people around them could feel, even if neither of them dared to speak about it. Every time they ended up in the same room, the air felt different, heavier, charged with something they didn't understand but couldn't control. Ruby tried to pretend she didn't notice. James watching her during class. She tried to focus on her notes, her exams, her goals. But sometimes she could feel his gaze like a warm light on her skin, steady and impossible to shake off. When she lifted her eyes and caught him staring, he didn't look away fast enough. It always left her breathless, annoyed, and confused all at once. James told himself he was only curious. That was his excuse. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was something about Ruby's calm strength that unsettled him. She didn't flinch under pressure, didn't bow to social rules at Maxton Hall, didn't follow the crowd. She moved through the school like she had a purpose that didn't revolve around popularity or power. And James, who had lived his whole life inside those things, didn't know how to handle someone who didn't care about them. Their arguments started to change too. At first, they were sharp and cold. Now they were charged with emotion, like they were each trying to push the other away before something deeper could break through. When Ruby challenged him, James felt a strange mix of frustration and admiration. When he threw sarcastic comments her way, she fired back with words that hit harder than he expected. One afternoon, during a group project meeting, they stood across from each other, both pretending to focus on the assignment, but their eyes kept meeting, as if drawn together against their will. The room fell quiet for a moment, and even their classmates sensed something shifting. It was the kind of moment where time felt slower, the kind where something new begins, even if no one says a word. Neither of them knew it yet. But the tension they tried to hide was slowly pulling them into a connection that would change everything, whether they liked it or not. It happened on a day that started like any other quiet hallways. Rushed students, and the pressure of grades hanging over everyone's head. Ruby had stayed late in the library trying to finish an important assignment, the kind that determined her future. She didn't expect anyone else to be there, especially not James. But fate had a habit of placing them in the same space at the exact moment they were least prepared for it. When James walked into the library, it wasn't with his usual confidence. He looked tired, weighed down by something he wasn't ready to talk about. Ruby noticed it instantly. She didn't want to care, but she did. His usual sharp eyes were softer, almost lost, and for the first time, she saw the cracks beneath his perfect image. His life wasn't as effortless as everyone believed. There was a heaviness in him, a pressure she could only guess at. James hadn't expected to see Ruby either. She sat alone at a table, surrounded by books and notes, completely focused. He admired that about Hertha. The way she worked, the way she pushed herself, the way she carried her dreams like armor. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she looked tired too, overwhelmed in a way she rarely showed. Their eyes met in the quiet room. There were no sarcastic comments, no tension-filled arguments, no forced distance. Just two people, standing in the same silence. Seeing each other clearly for the first time, James approached her slowly, unsure but drawn in. Ruby didn't look away. She didn't fight the moment. Instead, she let herself acknowledge what she had been denying for weeks. He wasn't just the arrogant boy she tried to avoid. He was a person carrying burdens no one else saw. He stopped beside her table. For once his voice wasn't confident, it was gentle. "Are you okay?" he asked. Ruby expected something else. Maybe a tease. Maybe a comment meant to annoy her. But his question felt real, honest. It caught her off guard more than any argument ever had. She nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. "Are you?" James hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Not really." It was a simple exchange, barely a conversation. But it felt different. It felt important, because for the first time the walls they built so carefully began to crumble just a little, just enough for them to see the truth behind each other's eyes. And from that small, quiet moment, their story shifted. After that night in the library, something between James and Ruby changed. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't spoken aloud, but it was real. Their walls, those strong, stubborn barriers they had built to protect themselves, began to weaken. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like cracks spreading through glass. Ruby found herself thinking about James more than she wanted to. Not the polished version of him everyone else saw, but the tired boy who admitted he wasn't okay. She wasn't used to seeing that kind of honesty in someone like him. It made her wonder what he carried behind the perfect reputation, the expensive clothes, the confident walk. She didn't want to care, but she did, and that scared her. James was just as unsettled. He kept remembering the way Ruby looked at him that night. Steady, gentle, without judgment. No one ever saw him that way, not even the people closest to him. Ruby had seen more in a few quiet seconds than anyone had in years, and now he couldn't get her out of his head. He noticed the small things about Hertha, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the way she bit her lip when she worried, the strength in her voice when she stood up for herself. They didn't magically become friends. They didn't start talking all the time, but something invisible connected them now. When they passed each other in the hall, there was a softness, a pause, like they were both remembering that moment in the library. When they spoke in class, their tones held less sharpness. The tension was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer cold. It was warm, charged, almost fragile. Their friends noticed too. Some whispered, some guessed, but James and Ruby ignored it all. They didn't know what was happening, and they definitely weren't ready to define it. All they knew was this. For the first time, it didn't feel like they were on opposite sides. One afternoon, James held the door open as Ruby walked into the study hall. It was such a simple gesture, something he probably wouldn't have done weeks ago. Ruby didn't comment, but when she looked up at him, there was a small, genuine smile, one she couldn't hide, even if she tried. It stayed with him long after she walked away. And for the first time, James felt something dangerous but hopeful. He wanted to be someone Ruby could trust, someone she didn't have to guard herself against, someone worthy of that quiet smile. Neither of them knew where this new connection would lead, but both of them felt it. The slow, undeniable truth that their story was no longer something they could ignore. Just when things between James and Ruby began to soften, life decided to test them. Their growing connection didn't go unnoticed, and in a place like Maxton Hall, nothing stayed hidden for long. Whispers started spreading small at first, then louder. People talked when they thought Ruby wasn't listening. People stared when they thought James didn't care. And suddenly, the simple act of looking at each other felt heavier. Ruby hated it. She had worked so hard to stay invisible, to focus on her grades, to build a future without distractions. The last thing she wanted was to be the center of rumors. Every time she heard someone mention her name alongside James's, her chest tightened. She didn't want her hard work to be overshadowed by gossip. She didn't want to be seen as the girl who got close to James Beaufort for attention, but that wasn't fair to him or to her. James, on the other hand, was used to attention. But this was different. The moment people started linking him to Ruby, the expectations around him shifted. His friends questioned him, some teasing, others warning. They didn't understand why he cared about a girl who wasn't from their world. His father's pressure grew stronger too, even if he didn't say it directly. The Beaufort name came with rules. Ruby didn't fit any of them. Their growing closeness began to feel like walking on a thin line. One wrong step, and everything could fall apart. Then came the day that changed everything. Ruby overheard two students talking about her, mocking her, doubting her, twisting her friendship with James into something ugly. She tried to ignore it, but James walked in at that exact moment. He saw her frozen, hurt, and he heard every cruel word. Something inside him snapped. Without thinking, he stepped in. His voice sharp and cold in a way Ruby had never heard directed at anyone but her. He defended her fiercely, almost angrily, as if their words had been a personal attack on him. The room fell silent. The students backed off. But Ruby didn't feel comforted. She felt exposed when they were finally alone. She whispered, "You didn't have to do that." James looked at her, frustration mixing with something much softer. "Yes, I did." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was emotional, raw, full of everything they still weren't saying out loud. Ruby felt her heart beat faster. James felt the weight of what he had just shown her. That moment made one thing painfully clear. Their connection wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't something they could hide or ignore or pretend away. It was real. And real things always came with consequences. After James stood up for Ruby, everything between them grew more intense, more real. But real feelings often bring real problems, and the pressure around them didn't disappear. It grew. And soon, the weight of their worlds started pulling them in opposite directions. Ruby tried to focus on her goals more than ever. She reminded herself why she came to Maxton Hall: to study, to earn her scholarship, to build a future for herself and her family. She couldn't let emotions distract her, especially not emotions involving James, whose life was far too complicated. But pushing him away wasn't easy anymore. Every time she tried, she remembered the way he stood up for her, the way he looked at her with something almost protective in his eyes. James was struggling too. He didn't know how to balance the two sides of his life anymore. Part of him was expected to follow his family's strict path, to act like the perfect Beaufort heir. The other part, the part that grew louder every day, wanted to be near Ruby, to break free from the expectations that had controlled him for so long. He was stuck between what he had always known and what he was beginning to feel. Then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. It happened during a school event, one filled with parents, teachers, and eyes that judged every move. Ruby had been assigned to help organize the program, and she worked with quiet determination, wanting nothing more than to get through the day without causing any attention. But James showed up unexpectedly, looking stressed, irritated, and clearly upset about something. Ruby noticed instantly. She always noticed when something was wrong with him now. When she asked what happened, James hesitated. He didn't want to drag her into his family drama, but he also didn't want to lie. He finally admitted that his father had questioned him about the rumors, about Ruby, about the image of their family. His father made it clear that being close to Ruby was a problem. Ruby froze. She felt the words hit harder than she expected. Not because she cared about his father's opinion, but because she knew what it meant. Their connection wasn't just complicated, it was dangerous for him. Before she could respond, James said the one thing she didn't want to hear but had feared all along. "Maybe it's better if we keep our distance."
Ouch.
Ruby felt something inside her break. She tried to stay calm, but her voice trembled as she answered, "I never asked you to choose me over your family." "I know," he whispered, "but I'm choosing you anyway, and it's ruining everything." The moment hung between them, fragile and painful. James wasn't rejecting her, not exactly. He was just trapped. Ruby understood that more than anyone. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. She took a step back, her heart tight. "Then maybe some distance is exactly what we need." James didn't stop her. He didn't know how. And Ruby walked away, not because she wanted to, but because she believed it was the only way to protect both of them. It was the breakpoint neither of them saw coming. A moment that didn't end their story but changed it forever. The days that followed were heavy, quiet, and colder than either of them expected. Ruby and James hadn't yelled at each other. They hadn't fought. They hadn't broken anything except the fragile connection they were just beginning to understand. And somehow, silence hurt more than any argument ever could. Ruby tried to bury herself in her work. She convinced herself that this distance was good, that it gave her space to breathe. But every time she walked into school, she felt the empty space where James used to be, those accidental eye contacts. Those moments when he looked at her like she was the only person he really saw. Now he walked past her without a word. He didn't meet her eyes. He didn't even try. And that quiet avoidance cut deeper than she cared to admit. James felt the absence too, even if he pretended otherwise.